Rabbi Joseph, good morning. Welcome to you from our nation's capital to uh, the better climate of Rio de Janeiro. I hope you are well.
Yes, the better climate and increasingly getting closer to Carnival.
and by comparison, saner
So,
politics. Um,
yes, thank you, Bill Maher, for the shout out.
so, Joseph, you wanted to talk about an article by Yehuda Kurtzer entitled "We Must Continue to Support."
President of the Shalom, yes, the Shalom Hartman Center in Jerusalem. It was posted yesterday, and it is thoughtful and I believe timely.
Yeah,
Look, we are 114 days into a war that is brutal and exhausting. It is creating havoc globally, uh, creating new, heretofore tragically unexpected, unexperienced conflicts with proxies like Hamas. Three American service people have now died.
yeah,
The nature of Hamas is something that is very, very difficult to grasp, much the way we took months to understand 9/11 and Al Qaeda. We are not Israelis. I include myself as a diaspora Jew, the collective Jewish people. We are not fighting a war against a nation. This is not the War of Independence, the 67 war, the 73 war, the Lebanese conflict. This is against a terrorist organization.
yeah,
The confusion between terrorism and the destruction of the Palestinian population. But the Palestinians remain stateless, and they absolutely must have a state of their own. And the state of Israel has made serious mistakes during its 75-year history in not hastening that reality. But here we are, the 1st of February 2023, 114 days into a conflict that has added to the divisions in our world. Yehuda Kurtzer writes from the perspective of an American modern Orthodox academic who asks questions about what a Jew, and I bring it to our conversation, a non Jew should be thinking about.
mm-hmm.
How do we both support the necessity of a war created by slaughter? Not a slaughter that can be compared quantitatively or qualitatively to the costs of war among the Palestinian people. I can't, I won't, it diminishes the innocence of those killed. I want, and I join Yehuda Kurtzer in doing this, to remain a committed diaspora Jew who proudly says he is a Zionist. But I learned this week from a friend that we share, Tony Jones, that statement, I am a Zionist, now excludes me
Hmm. What
among many.
So what did Tony say?
Well, he praised our podcast, but said, Edelheit, your self label, which you have explained, defended, and offered Christians a new understanding of, divides you from those who are more progressive.
Mm-hmm.
I thought Kurtzer helps me better feel the burden of alienation and being alone as someone committed to dialogue, to patience and understanding. But post October 7th, I, for one, could not hide merely as a diaspora Jew. I'm a Zionist, not as a disgusting, vulgar, violent, hateful person. I am a Zionist because the Jewish people have earned and deserve their own destiny, not at the expense of the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would encourage people, if they haven't viewed or listened to some of our first conversations, you laid out a definition of Zionism that was very helpful, I think, for people.
But here we are, much longer than any war in the 75 years.
Mm-hmm.
A war that was not initiated, desired, but yet a war provoked by Iran, paid by Iran, Qatar. Who knows? It's a terrorist organization expelled and unwanted by Egypt, determined to eliminate the state of Israel. Because Zionism is a colonialist, racist project.
The article by Yehuda Kurtzer, it begins by identifying with the Zionism of Amos Oz, someone who was is leftist but otherwise a Zionist, and there's
an
a quote.
Extraordinary Israeli public intellectual and author.
And so towards the top of the article, there is a quote from Amos Oz from 2014, I believe. And it says, "Unlike European pacifists, I never believed the ultimate evil in the world is war. In my view, the ultimate evil in the world is aggression. And the only way to repel aggression is, unfortunately, by force. That is where the difference lies between a European pacifist and an Israeli peacenik like myself." I think that's a very helpful distinction to draw for a lot of what Reinhold Niebuhr would consider utopian-minded people on the left.
Look, last Sunday was the UN stipulated International Memorial of the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. January 27th, 1945, being the day that the then Soviet Allied troops liberated Auschwitz and Birkenau camps. If we've learned anything in the not yet 80 years, it is there are times when if you are not responsive to aggression, then you are victims. Mm-hmm. So I think Yehuda's quoting of Amos Oz, I think his situating the reality of a war that no one wanted. But here we are and the havoc in Gaza among innocent Palestinians, let's assume that 1/3 of whatever the number of reality is, 25, 26,000, I don't know, 1/3 of it are Hamas combatants. And then the children, the women, tragically used as intentional human shields in urban warfare. I am not defending this, but what does the world want from a nation who is the sought after goal of an eliminationist terrorist organization? So, as Yehuda does at the end of each of the elements of his support for an Israeli war, not created by Israel, I too say, I'm a 77-year-old plus retired rabbi professor, deeply and more committed to dialogue than ever. I don't have answers to the questions we share. But I do know that the existential survival of many peoples in the Middle East has now been put on the table.
Yeah. So to that point, Yehuda writes in this article, the visible failings of many in the global left over the past 114 days have done little to assuage my own anxiety about where I stand on this war. The rape denialism among progressive groups, the slanderous overreach in characterizing Israel's behavior as genocide, the quick leap to calls for ceasefire instantly after October 7th, denying Israel the legitimacy of self-defense, and the regular omission of calls to release the hostages as part of the ceasefire conversation are all colossal moral failures, and they have helped me understand my own political positionality. Israel has a just cause in its victimhood and just cause to fight back. And then Yehuda continues, however, just because the most extreme articulation of an anti-war position caricatures itself in this way does not mean there is no room for legitimate skepticism about the war. No war should be able to demand indefinite loyalty. And then the
And
article
there
goes on.
is simply, yes, I'm sorry.
No. And then the article goes on to lay out 3 critiques that the author identifies.
Look, as we move now into a divisive, vulgar political arena, issues that one would not have ever imagined. A democratic president supporting the state of Israel in a battle for its existence. But now the war has lasted too long, and the destruction of the civilian population in Gaza has, in fact, reached a point beyond which popular support is at any level sustainable.
Mhm.
So, morally, religiously, politically, philosophically, ethically, find a category, and I will sit and engage anyone in the necessity for this war to end, which it could have, and in my view, should have, when the world shared the condemnation of Hamas. Stop it. Return all the hostages. When I speak to my friends in Israel, the division there now is, can we destroy more with any hope of the hostages being returned? Or must we now say the conflict is ended in order to retrieve not 136, because surely many, maybe as much as a half, are now dead. We will be, again, the collective Jewish community, We will be watching as Israel negotiates to retrieve people and or bodies for terrorists that have been imprisoned for committing murder. There is no question that this was a part of the Hamas terrorist calculation. And there is no question, when push comes to shove, Israel will do whatever is needed to retrieve those who are alive and the remains of those who have already perished.
I read
It is a bitterness already to a traumatized community.
What other sorts of things, when you talk with your friends in Israel, what sorts of feelings do they offer?
They're exhausted. They're exhausted. The economy has shifted because of the number of businesses that had to be closed because of those called up to service. Many Israelis have had to be resettled, not only from the south and the area near Gaza, but the north, where things have certainly been unstable because of Hezbollah. It is still a politically exhausted country. No one wants this government, but for this government to fall is to deepen the division.
Explain that.
Israel is a parliamentary democracy. There is no direct election of a prime minister. The president is an honorific position. The prime minister comes from one of many parties. The parties create coalitions. You vote for parties. 62 seats are required to establish a government. The more parties there are, the more collective the coalitions have to be. This government is the most rightist politically and religiously in the 75-year history of Israel. It has a margin of 2 seats.
Sounds familiar.
It is possible. Yeah, absolutely. And that is something we are finding globally. There is no more shared vision. So I speak with a younger colleague in Israel, a young rabbi who's starting a new congregation. And he asks questions that I have never asked in my entire rabbinate. If we meet in the open area of the hall they rent, what do they do when the siren goes off? How quickly can they get people, older people, people in wheelchairs, to the bunker? How do you calculate that on a Shabbat Eve?
Yeah.
So, the cost of this war has not been calculated for the Jewish psyche in Israel and globally. Since October 7th, Jews are not the same as they were on October 5th and 6th. And so Yehuda Kurtzer is lining up a public conversation for Jews in the diaspora who have a choice and are constantly being torn because of politics, because of social and cultural divisions, age, generational commitments. I didn't permit my children to play with guns. My son, who's uh, hysterical about the fact that I took the guns from the Star Wars figures, and he would go to his friends and play with their weapons.
So I'm guessing you haven't done a lot of hunting with Tony Jones?
Now, Tony is waiting. He thinks the day before the second coming, what I call the Messianic age, that is the day I will go out and shoot pheasants or a deer or elk with him. I connect him with Jews who do hunt. He hopes they will, quote, convert me to see the light. I've never held a gun. I have not a revulsion, but it seems to be, for me, an extension of the inability to engage in what we do.
Speaking of guns, because I think there's an analogy to draw between the toll of school shootings in the U.S. and the toll in Gaza. And Yehuda Kurtzer, that's the first critique offered in this article. It says the first critique of the war is the death toll. Surely there must be a limit to supporting a war as the number of Gazan civilian deaths continue to climb. But here is the thing. This is important, I think. Since every death in war is a tragedy, there is simply no objective way to determine what quantity of deaths should be considered acceptable, and when we cross an imaginary threshold to say that there are too many. That's an obvious, but I think little observed point.
There is no context when one looks at the, quote, ethics of a just war, and you raise the question of proportionality, which we did in among our first 2 or 3 conversations. I can't know what is proportional to the horrific slaughter, rape, maiming, kidnapping of October 7th. There isn't a vocabulary that permits me to translate to know proportionality. So, because I can't, I agree with Yehuda. There is probably a number, but it's not a number any of us would ever understand. Nor do I think what occurred on October 7th can or should be equivocal to X or Y or Z number of Palestinian deaths. This is for me, a wonderful example of incommensurate differences. They had to fight a war in order to defend themselves and begin the process of dismantling Hamas and leveraging force to negotiate the return of hostages.
Yeah. Yehuda writes, I cannot say personally whether the Palestinian death toll demands an end to this war. I cannot say with certainty, and neither can anyone, what percentage of the death toll has been civilians and what has been combatants. But because leaving Hamas in place creates a permanent and imminent threat to Israeli lives, there is no obvious stopping point. I feel that I can only pray for there to be fewer deaths going forward.
And I would add, I can only pray for more people to accept the utter complexity of the reality we are all facing, so that from the river to the sea does not help share the burden of that complexity.
Correct.
When I taught at St. Cloud State University for the then pro-Palestinian forces to let me share a panel, I was told that would be like asking a rapist to be given a chance to sit next to the rape victim. So I can't translate, and here Yehuda is very important. We cannot translate our empathy and support a war that defends our existence. I get it. No one accepts my empathy while I support that war. Okay, here we are. There is no number we can agree upon, and no one believes that we care anymore.
I read related to your anecdote. I read this week about concern in the White House about anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian protests at the Democratic Convention in Chicago coming up this summer.
Oh, absolutely. There is no doubt. I can flood your mailbox with situations of schools, high schools, now not universities, high schools, now being forced to determine what free speech limits there should be. So, the slaughter on October 7th has no free speech element to it. So, there is an unequivocal asymmetry to the beginning of this conversation. And many people can say, okay, October 7th was terrible, absolutely terrible. Okay, the hostages must be returned. Enough said. Now, ceasefire. Complexity, ambiguity. That is why this article is important, though I wish my friend Yehuda had used those words. What we are collectively facing are circumstances so complex at such a threshold. What will the President of the United States do in response to the death of three U.S. service people? We're not going to bomb Tehran. And there are people who are asking for that. Nor are we going to ignore it. Where in the middle is a shared collective sense of justice, empathy. How do I support yet another American violent response? Because any response that does not destroy something is not strong enough.
Mm-hmm.
And our divisions are so extreme. How do we somehow say, no, it's necessary, but where do we calculate enough? The border is a serious problem. We won't solve it for political reasons. Are we so divided that everything now has become politically transactional?
Yeah.
I am a proud Zionist. I am a rabbi with a doctorate in Christian theology, committed to finding new ways to communicate extreme difference.
You talked about transactions a moment ago. The second critique that Yehuda offers here is the fate of the hostages. Um, Writing, some argue that we must prioritize their safe release over the other stated military objectives of the war. Many of the hostages' families are demanding that Israel do whatever it needs to bring them home, no matter the cost. And we are right to be chagrined in the presence of their public suffering. The dilemma that Israel faces in balancing between the objectives of trying to defeat Hamas and trying to redeem our hostages, that word redeem is important, is excruciating and laced with moral complexity. Hamas has successfully exploited the compassionate love that we Jews have for our fellow Jews, and their ruthlessness in seizing the vulnerable together with the healthy demonstrates that they know that the price we will pay is staggering. But now, is that price too high?
I'm not sure, and I don't criticize Yehuda's rhetorical question. I'm not sure I could bear even writing that question.
Mm-hmm.
And as I shared with you early in our conversations, there are rabbinic conversations about the ethics of redeeming hostages.
Yeah.
This is not some new 21st century dilemma in Jewish history. When Jews are kidnapped for the purpose of quantum political concessions, the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics.
Yeah.
If Jews must deal with the threat of being kidnapped globally in order to leverage Israeli politics, this is not a problem that Israel faces. Americans remain among those hostages.
Yeah.
American Jews. And make no mistake about it, Hamas will ask for all Palestinian prisoners to be set free. We don't negotiate with terrorists is a formula that everyone seems to know, unless it's your family on the other side of what the terrorists are leveraging.
Yeah.
You know, when the Aseret Debrot, the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments, says, "Thou shalt not steal," in the Exodus and Deuteronomy text, steal in that context refers to kidnapping. Not robbery, not embezzlement, not burglary, kidnapping.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, at what point can a modern nation state argue with a terrorist organization who continues to confirm its eliminationist desires? Where in the world another modern nation state would make concessions as are being now negotiated by Hamas? A 6-week pause, but none of the Israeli military. So, complex, he uses the word, but it's more dire than complex.
Mm-hmm.
And the battle over a complete ceasefire does not end the negotiations.
Yeah.
They are demanding a complete ceasefire now. All of the prisoners.
So the third criticism that Yehuda offers is victory. Yehuda writes, the third important criticism against continuing the war is the claim that Israel's objectives have not been met so far, or worse, that they cannot succeed. It is hard to tell if Israel is quote unquote winning, if the Hamas leadership's with the Hamas leadership still in place. And the critique of how Israel is prosecuting the war is increasingly tied to speculation that an indefinite, purposeless war is a strategy that Prime Minister Netanyahu is employing to advance his own political aspirations. How does an indefinite war serve him?
They won't pull a war cabinet down.
Okay, so it's just that practicality.
The minute the war is to be ended in a negotiated ceasefire, his career is over. Less than 15% of the Israeli population, as currently polled, wants him. There is a resolution being submitted that he's unfit for the office. So I don't believe, I can't stomach the thought that even this narcissist would expend the horror of this war to sustain his role. But okay, what do I know? I think the idea of winning.
So you're suggesting that it's not safe to elect a narcissist to national office? Is that...
You want me to fill in that blank? Right. I don't think narcissism is a good calculus for contemporary leadership.
I had a number of people this past Sunday uncomfortable with the illusion and analogy I was drawing between Ahab and the prophets of Baal. It's just sometimes they're just too easy.
Yep. And how could the ancient text actually be that prescient?
Yeah. Oh, and someone was like, I'm not comfortable with, you bringing politics into the pulpit. And I was like, the book is named Kings. What do you want me to do?
Well, there it is. Yes. I've had that thrown back at me many times. And I try to say, I'm talking about values. If there are people connected to the values I'm discussing, so be it.
Yeah.
I think the word winning, victory, is going to be a word we have to spend a lot of time discussing. Not just winning a war. What does winning anything mean today? No one wins after this conflict is over. No one wins anything. Certainly not the people living in Gaza who had nothing to do with the Hamas attack. I don't know how Hamas calculates their sense of victory. They have moved the Palestinian issue center and front, no longer the normalization of non-Palestinian Arabs. Okay, they won it. They have won the public social media victory of the narrative. They've won it. Okay.
Yehuda writes, is it possible that amidst the fog of war, some aspects of the Israeli invasion have succeeded more than we think? And most of all, if you have decided that you know enough to establish that this war is unwinnable by this strategy, what military strategy do you offer us instead? These three arguments opposing continuing the war raise serious issues, questions, and doubts, but they are not dispositive enough to create a moral imperative that we oppose this war. Unlike the first weeks of this war, when supporting the war felt essential to ensure the legitimacy of Israel's right to self defense, I feel secure in my views, but recognize the moral legitimacy of various opinions. I think that's a very thoughtful way of putting it.
I cannot begin to imagine Israelis ever saying that what they've achieved is a victory. What they will have achieved is a brutal necessity, not a victory.
Mm-hmm.
They will have incrementally diminished the capacity of Hamas. They will not have destroyed it. I doubt they will be able to push out the Hamas leadership, even in exile. They will have defended themselves from an immediacy. But the trauma done to Israel, I would add, to world Jewry, I have not begun to calculate that. The conflict will end. There will be no winners. Everyone is a loser at different levels, at points in which we can't yet determine how much we've lost.
So, where are you at personally, existentially, with all of this week?
I sensed being more alone, not than ever, but more aware again of how alone I am.
Yeah.
I think other Jews talk about. I don't want yet another conversation with a Jew who is much more extreme, either to the quote right or to the left, terms that have less and less meaning. To be centrist, to be thoughtful, to be filled with questions for which answers are not available, which is why I sent you this article. It represents values to which I adhere. This is not a place where you know yourself to be, how shall I put it, embraced. I'm blessed to be in this conversation with someone I trust and with whom I feel safe. But again this week, a couple of incidents, words. Oh, you've made it clear you're a Zionist. People aren't interested in engaging with someone who's a Zionist. That already is a trigger.
Yeah.
Whoa, okay. I think the division in America is boiling over, and the disbelief among many. $83.3 million in defamation for a man who clearly is going to be nominated once again to run for the presidency, who has enough political clout to have the United States Congress say, you know what, we're really not interested in solving the immediate crisis at the border because its value politically is greater. I don't know what that means. How could we have gotten to this place where engagement,
And I think
engagement,
it will. I mean, I'm not the first person to say this, but I think you're drawing it out once again that the lesson of October 7th is that these sort of endless, pointless, partisan culture battles leave a nation vulnerable to outside aggression.
So yesterday, the tech CEOs came and were questioned, and there was again political circus. Turn around and apologize. Was there any governance? Was there any substantive governance between the economics of a country, the Senate of a country, and the people who drive both the economy and the government? What is the matter with us?
I think
If
there was a Jew who said something about how you can't serve God and mammon. I think that's one of the takeaways.
Well, that is in a simpler, ancient, historical context. I'd like to have that Jew sitting with me, calculating what the contemporary complexity and ambiguity mean. We created these tech companies. We are responsible for the economic boom, the trillions of dollars that it has created globally. And now we have to talk about limits. Limits. Isn't that what human beings have always had to talk about?
Yeah.
Limits. I'm going to put you in a garden. Please don't eat from the fruit of that tree. Now, the problem in that narrative is you also didn't teach the people what prohibition meant. You hadn't yet taught them don't. Okay, what are the limits? We're asking the same questions that have been asked in the text we share. When the Holy One calls out to the first humans, Ayecha, where are you? I think that's a question we're getting asked every single day.
Mm-hmm.
Not just a spatial question, but a relational question. What? What?
Yeah.
So, October 7th, the horrific Gaza conflict, it is going to end. The question is when and at what accumulated costs to the people in Gaza, the Palestinians, and the state of Israel. Okay, there will be at some point a final accounting. There's always a final accounting.
Yeah.
It is a necessary moment of reflection. Yehuda Kurtzer is one of many articles that we must share about how to prepare for that final accounting. But
Yeah, the article ends pointing towards that. It says, and a commitment to fight for what is just right now, which also need not be limited to calling for an end to the war, should include the obligation incumbent on us to fight against the spillover effects of discrimination and violence against Palestinian citizens of Israel, a vigilante violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, and the dangerous threat from extremists to resettle Gaza after the war.
And the global silence that has provoked the biggest increase of anti-Semitism since the 1930s.
Well, Yehuda ends by saying that we should pray for it, and that's what I exhort people to do.
And I do too. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, you have to pray with your feet. And that means don't just pray with words. And for God's sake, use words in your prayers that you mean. Don't just use words you can read.
Well, Joseph, thank you for your time.
Always. I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.